Shehir b'tzivos tovos.
That's what I hope. Yeah. Okay. Our learning sponsors. Year of Learning by Sue and Arnie Gerlich in memory of Malka Pearl Mann and Philip Mann, and in memory of their family murdered in the Holocaust. Harav Tzvi Hirsch ben Shlomo Yaakov, Sarah bat Ephraim, Yisrael David ben Harav Tzvi Hirsch, Ephraim ben Harav Tzvi Hirsch, Adia bas Harav Tzvi Hirsch, Miriam bas Harav Tzvi Hirsch, Pesel bas Harav Tzvi Hirsch, Shalom ben Harav Tzvi Hirsch, Shlomo Yaakov ben Harav Tzvi Hirsch, Shmuel ben Harav Tzvi Hirsch. Shall assure her children and grandchildren in memory of her uncle, founding member of BRS, Dr. Israel Brook, Yisrael ben Harav Akiva, Marsha Federbush and family, in memory of her husband, Dr. Oriel Paul Federbush, Oriel Pinchas ben Harav Shimon, Sharon and Fred Lisker, their family and many friends, in memory of her dear mom, Harriet Friedman, Etel Bat Yaakov, Leslie and Gail Kaplan, in memory of their parents, Harry and Marjorie Sedell and Irving and Pearl Kaplan, friends of Avi Gitler, Avrameir ben Shimon, and Martha Gitler, Charna Bas Yeshaya, friends of Toby Peres, Sarah Tova Bat Yisrael Dov, friends of Malka Levi, Malka Bat Yosef, friends of Joe Wolf, Yosef ben Chaim, many friends of Marvin Blush, Dr. Marvin Blush, Moshe Shalom ben Yitzchak Halevi, A Month of Learning by Haran and Mel Haller, in memory of her father, Yosef Eliezer ben Tzvi Hirsch, by B. Pizer, in memory of her father, Yitzchak Dov ben Shmuel, by Mordechai and Miriam Burr, in memory of his mother, Manya Bas Harav Shimon Halevi, Stanley Presser, in memory of his wife, Chaya Leah Bat Zev HaKohen, and A Week of Learning by Bonnie Gelb Jackson, in memory of her father, Mordechai Yoel ben Binyamin, as well as Judy and Michael Poretsky, in memory of her mother, Razel Bas Yehuda Leib. May the Shemas have an aliyah, crank Rafi about the Yeshua Shem Matzliah, L'chol B'nai Yisrael a good Geben Shtiyah.
Amen v'amen.
Okay, Steve, where are you?
We've made it home. I'm not set up yet, but we made it home.
Very good. Okay, we are on the Kaf Daled Amud Aleph today. Okay, and but I want us to start by going back very briefly to Kaf Gimel Amud Beis. Okay, Rebbe was responding to Rabbi Dosa. Okay, Rabbi Dosa had said about 7 lines up from the bottom, right? Omer l'rabot b'gdei kohen gadol b'yom haKippurim. That he argued that the phrase Yilbash al Basaro was to allow other Kohanim to use the high priest's garments, but that the high priest could not use them for a second or further Yom Kippur. Right? Sheksherim like Kohen Hedyat, that they were viable for a common Kohen. Amar Rebbe disagrees and says, Shtei Tshuvot b'davar, that there were 2 answers. Chada, 1, the Avneto shel Kohen Gadol, lo zehu Avneto shel Kohen Hedyat, that they did not have the same kind of belt. Remember we said Kohen Gadol was from Shatnez, Kohen Ragil, no. Va'od, and furthermore, Begadim shenishtameshet behen kedusha yichamura, tishtamesh behen kedusha kala, garments that were used for a more stringent or a higher sanctity, would they be used for a lower sanctity? Elamat Talmud Lomar, but what do we mean by that? Lavash, okay, mean to put on. The Rabot et hashchakim. That's where we finished, that it meant that it was permitted to put on the worn garments so long as they're still doable, viable, okay? Why? Because remember we said that totally worn garments of a Kohen, like the pants or the belt, were then ripped into shreds to be used as the wicks, right? That was the point. Now, So now the pasuk continues with us on on Kaf Dal at the top of the Amud. V'hinicham sham, but when the pasuk says to leave them there, what is it referring to? Milamed shetu'unin gniza. That would seem to imply that they need to be hidden away. Rabbi Dosa Omer, Re'uyin Hain, the Kohen Hidyat. But Rabbi Dosa said that they are worthy, suitable, let's say, for a common Kohen. Umat Talmud Lomar V'hinicham Sham. So then how did Rabbi Dosa understand the phrase V'hinicham Sham in the Torah? Shelo Yishtamesh Bahem Yom HaKippurim Acher. That the high priest, the Kohen Gadol, was not permitted to use them on another occasion of Yom HaKippur. Mai lav b'hakamiflagei? Wasn't this what they were arguing about? Demar savar avodahi, that one master felt that what we're talking about here, the Trumat Hadeshin, okay, was a part of the avoda. Umar savar lav avodahi, and the other master felt it was not part of the avoda. Okay, no, says the Gemara. The kuli alma avodahi. No, everyone was in agreement that Trumat Hadeshin is part of the sacred service, part of the avoda. Bahacha miflagei. But here, this is what they were really arguing about. Mar savar tzricha krala rebuye. One master felt that it was necessary to have a verse and to derive from the verse, in other words, to include, to enlarge, to include in the verse the requirement for the mitznefet and the avnate, for the miter and the belt. Umar savar lo tzricha krala rebui, and the other master felt that it was not necessary to require a pasuk to include those two items, okay, as opposed to the specific two that were mentioned in the pasuk. Okay? So now at this point, we get to a new item, a new discussion, which was really the earlier discussion about Trumat Hadeshin. So we're, in a sense, a new aspect of the same general subject, okay? And so the Gemara tells us, by Rabbi Avin, Rabbi Avin asked the following shaila: Trumat Hadeshin bekama. Regarding the removal of the ash, what is the amount that has to be removed? Okay? Now, can we draw a parallel between other examples when there's removal of a substance that therefore would give us the information? It so happens that we do have two such examples. One that says we remove 1/100th, and one that says we remove 1/500th. So let's see. Mitrumat ma'aser yalfinamla. Do we say that we learn from the truma of a tithe? That's where we learn, right? The question. Because there we would only take off 1/100th, right? That's the point that we would have there, okay? 1%. Oh, right? Or perhaps mitrumat midyan yalfinamla. Or perhaps we learn it from the example, a different case of the material that was removed from the taking of the spoils from the conquering of Midian. And in that particular case, we found it was 1/5 of 1%, 1/500th. Tashma, says the Braita. Listen to the following. Tatani Rabbi Chia, as taught by Rabbi Chia, Ne'emar Kan. It says the word here, Veherim, in the pasuk, right? That he shall take up and use it, right? That pasuk, okay? And then veherim v'ne'amar lahalan veherim. And elsewhere also it says veherim, to take up, okay? Now, ma lahalan bekumso, afkan bekumso. So on the one hand, we have the phrase, and we make then this gezerah shava on the same language. Since there it takes up a handful, so here too, we're taking up a handful. Okay? It's not from the Midian spoil, okay, but from the amount that's taken by a Kohen, okay, for the komets. Now, having said this, okay, a new statement. Ma Rav, says Rav, Arba avodot zar chayav alehen mita. Since we briefly raised the question whether Trumat Hadeshin was actually considered part of the avoda or not, we get to this side topic. According to Rav, there are 4 elements of the avoda that a non-Kohen would merit the death penalty were he to carry them out. Zrika, number 1, right? Namely the sprinkling. Vahaktara, number 2, that is basically burning, right? Or smoking of the fat, okay, are the offerings. 3, v'nisu chamayim, the water libation. And 4, v'nisu chayayim, the wine libation. Now, that was the view of Rav. Levi is going to give a different statement in the same context. V'Levi amar, af trumat hadeshen. So likewise, the removal of the ash. V'chein tane Levi b'matnita. And likewise, Levi taught that in a Mishnah. Af trumat hadeshen. So likewise, the removal of the ash. Now, Gemara wants to say in this machloket between Rav and Levi, my Talmud the Rav, what was Rav's view? Dichtiv. Why? Because we have a pasuk that says, Va'ata uvanecha itcha tishmeru et kuhunatchem l'chol davar hamizbeach ulemi beit leparochet uve'avadatem avodat matana attain et kuhunatchem v'hazar hakorev yumat. Okay? Loose translation of the pasuk: you and your sons, namely the Kohanim, okay, you shall guard your kuhnatchem, your service, for all things regarding the altar and for the house of the parochet, in other words, inside the heichal as well. V'avadatem avodat matana, and you shall do this service of giving. Okay, that will be your role, service as the Kohen, and a non-Kohen who attempts to come close to do so will die. Okay, now, avodat matana, it says avodat matana, the pasuk, a service of gifting, of putting on, velo avodat siluk, and not a service, worship of removal. And what do you do with Trumat Hadeshen? You're removing the ash. Va'avadatem. And the pasuk says, and you shall do this work. Avodah tama, implying again that it must be a complete work. Okay? In other words, an act in and of itself with no further aspects of avodah following it. V'lo avodah sheyesh acharaha, and no aspect of the avodah that has something following after it. Sheyesh achareha avodah, that has further worship acts following it. V'levi, and as far as Levi goes, okay, what's his view? Rebbe, okay, Rachmana lechol davar hamizbeach. Okay, Rebbe held, okay, his view. In other words, Levi was a younger Talmid Chaver of Rebbe. He was the transition generation from Tanaim to Amorim, and he had studied with Rebbe directly. And then, towards the end of his life, he left Eretz Yisrael and went to Bavel. So he was well regarded as a source. So according to Levi, what was Rebbe's view? Rabbi Rachmana, l'chol davar hamizbeach. Rebbe's view was that according to Hashem, when he said anything regarding the altar, and of course the Trumat Hadeshin is associated with the Mizbeach. The Rebbe. So the Gemara asks then, as far as Rebbe goes, Ha'u la'atuye sheva hazaot shebifnim. Rebbe, in his view, he also included, right, the 7 sprinklings that were done inside on the parochas, v'sheba mitzorah, and the multiple sprinklings that were done to purify a leper, a mitzorah. The Levi, and therefore Levi, where does he get his view? Nafka leimi davar v'chol davar. He derives it from the fact that in the pasuk, instead of saying a thing, all things, right? We said the pasuk said that, right? V'ata banecha itcha tishmru et kuhnatchem lechol davar hamizbeach. Okay, the Rebbe. If that's the case, what does Rebbe do with the drasha of Levi that learned it from davar and kol davar? What does Rebbe do? Davar v'chol davar lo darish. He does not darshan, interpret the difference in those words. Now, let's go on.
Ken, can I just go back a second?
Sure.
When you were talking about kamitza before,
Right.
how would he be able to do kamitza with the Trumas edition, with the ashes? Aren't they hot? To put his hand in there?
That's a good question, good practical question. Let's see if the Gemara addresses it, and if not, I'll suggest an answer, okay?
Fine.
Okay. Ve'ema, and I would say, l'chol davar hamizbeach klal. I might explain it this way, says the Gemara. When it says all items associated with the altar, that's a general principle. Avodat matana, that it's something that you put on. Prat, that's a detail. Klal uprat, when we have a generality and a detail. Ein beklal elamasha beprat. We don't say that the hermeneutic principles are such that what's in the general statement is really limited to what the specific is. Okay? Namely, avodat matana en. In other words, if it comes to putting something on the mizbeach, yes. Avodat siluk, lo. But something of worship, of removal, no, that is not permitted for a non-Kohen. Now, Amakra. Okay, so far it didn't answer Marvin's question. We'll see. It says the pasuk, Ulami beit la parochet v'yavadatem. When it says, right, within the parochet, the house of the parochet, in other words, within the second, the Kodshei Kadoshim, va'avadatem, and you shall worship it, observe it. El mi beit la parochet, hu de avodat matana, velo avodat siluk. There we're talking again also in the small altar, the gold altar inside, okay? That also refers to items being put on and it's not considered worship of removal. Okay, so again, that would be the point. Now the Gemara says the following. Are we making a difference then, okay, between what's inside, let's say the Heichal, even if it's not in the Kodesh Kadoshim, but in the Ulam, versus what's outside in the Azara? Okay? Ihachi, says the Gemara. If that, right? So the Gemara says, Ha bachutz, what about outside? Afilu avodat siluk. Do we say there also that worship regarding removal is forbidden to a non-Kohen? Ihachi. If that's the case, va'avadatem nami. When it says you shall do the service, also we could apply the same point. El mi beit leparochet hu. When we're talking about doing it inside, namely, let's say in the, if I got my sections correct, in the Heichal, right? The avoda tama, velo avoda sheyesh achareha avoda. Then we're talking about it has to be a completed act of worship and not an act of worship that has something following it. Ha bachutz, whereas perhaps outside, and I put the perhaps in there, afilu avodah sheyesh achareha avodah, that even then a situation where there is a worship act that follows after it, that would still be considered valid worship, okay? And therefore clearly exempt a non-Kohen and only require a Kohen. Now again, we have the pasuk that says v'avadatem, that you would do this service. Hadar arvei kra. Here again, we're mixing the psukim. By Rava. Rava said as follows and asked, Avodat siluk behechal mahu. Now we're seeing this issue, okay? Because we remember that in the, I'm grabbing my map for a second. Okay. You've got one area that's the Kodesh or the Heichal, and then you've got another area where there's the Parochet and the Kodesh Kadoshim. Okay, so those are two separate areas, and even in front of that, you've got the Ulam. Okay, so notice what his question is. Rebbe's question is, what about any avoda that's done in the Heichal? Now, remember what was in the Heichal? We had the menorah. We had the shulchan for the showbread, and we had the golden mizbeach. Okay? So that's important that we see his question there. So what happened?
You've got leftover oil and leftover wicks and everything else.
Exactly. That's Zev, right? Zev was saying you've got
Steve.
all these other items. Okay.
That's Steve.
Oh, Steve. Okay. That we're saying that were involved there, and in many cases, some of them had additional acts. Okay. It's one thing to remove the ash or the oil. But then with the menorah, for example, you had to put in the wicks and you had to light it and things like that. So now, having pointed that out, I think now we can continue in the Gemara, okay? So Rava asks, by Rava, avodat siluk behechal mahu. What about any kinds of worship in the Heichal that involved removals? Lifnim midaminan le. Do we say that it is similar to what goes on inside, o lachutz medaminan le, or do we say it's similar to what goes on outside? Okay. Hadar upashta. Rava then came back and explained it himself. Mi bait, since it says the word mi bait, and it also says in another pasuk, ula mi bait, we have a gezerah shava, it would appear. Ela, rather, me'ata, but rather from here. Zar shesider et hashulchan lechayev. If that's the case, then we're a non-Kohen to do the arrangement of the showbread on the table, okay, he ought to be guilty of the death penalty. Why? Because there are other acts. It's not simply enough to remove the old lechem, right? You've got to put the new one in. So that's the full act. Okay? So, but he's going to give a different example. Ika sidur bezichim. There's the arrangement of the zichim, of the spoons, right, that had incense on it. Sider zichim lechayev. And therefore, if a zar were to do the arrangement of the zichim, right, he ought to be guilty.
You got Didi on the phone from Israel.
Okay, go ahead, Mark. Okay. Ika siluk vahaktara. So he says here too, there is removal and kindling. Zar shasider et hamenorah lechayev. If that's the case, a non-Kohen who would be involved in the arrangement of the menorah also should be guilty of death penalty. Why? Ika netinat ptila. There's the fact that he has to apply putting on the wicks. If that's the case, as the Gemara, natan ptila lechayev. If a zar were to put the wicks in, he ought to be then guilty. Ika netinat shemen. But then there's the putting in of the oil. Natan shemen lechayev. Putting in the oil, the non-Kohen should be guilty. Ika hadlaka. Then we have the lighting. Hidlik lechayev. If the zar were to light the menorah wicks, right, ought to be guilty. Hadlaka lav avodahi. But the Gemara says maybe the kindling of the lights of the menorah are not part of the avoda. Velo? No, says the Gemara. Vahatanya. But aren't we taught elsewhere in a Braita? V'natnu b'nei Aharon hakohen eish al hamazbeach v'archu eitzim al ha'esh. That the Kohanim were given the role of putting the fire to the altar and of arranging the wood on the fire. Limeid al hatzatat alita. This tells us that it teaches us about the kindling of the chips of wood. In other words, they had to put wood chips underneath the main logs in order to first light them to get the logs to burn. Okay? So the Gemara continues, Shelo tehe ela bekohen kasher ubeklei sharet. This tells us that it can only be in a valid Kohen and with a appropriate service vessel. So the Gemara says, Hatzatat alita avodahi. It would appear then that the kindling of these chips, okay, of wood chips, is part of the sacred service. Hadlaka lav avodahi. But is that kindling also part of the worship? Ela me'ata. From here we see, rather, zar shesider et hamaracha l'chayev, that a non-Kohen who arranges the wood pile would be guilty. So the Gemara says, hold on, and remember we're talking about now outside, right, on the big altar. Okay? Ika sidur, shnei gzirei eitzim. But there's a further act, the arranging of the two main pieces of wood. Sider shnei gzirim l'chayiv. Then the non-Kohen who arranges these two major pieces of wood, which we put the offering on top of, that person ought to be guilty, obligated. Ika sidur avarim. No, says the Gemara, there's still another act to follow, and that's the arrangement of the limbs of the offering. So the Gemara raises now the following discussion. V'ha'amar Rav Asi. But didn't Rav Asi say, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, Zar shesider shnei gzirei itzim chayav, that a non-Kohen who arranged these two major blocks of wood is obligated, is to be punished? Bahapligi. This is what they're arguing about. Mar savar avoda tamai. One master felt that was a complete act of worship. Completed, done. Nothing followed it. Umar savar lav avoda tamai. And the other master thought that it wasn't a completed, finished act of worship. And what do we have, says the Gemara? Tanya kivate de Rav, v'tanya kivate de Levi. We have a Braita that teaches according to Rav, and a Braita that teaches according to Levi. Tanya kivate de Rav, the Braita that teaches according to Rav tells us as follows. Avodot shezar chayav alehem mita, the acts of worship that a non-Kohen is obligated, guilty of, okay, the death penalty. Zrikat dam bein lifnei lifnim, the sprinkling of the blood, whether it's inside or further inside. Okay? Now, inside might be in the Heichal, and further inside might be in the Kodshei Kedoshim. Vahamazeh b'chatat ha'of, and one who sprinkles the chatas of a bird offering. Next, vahamamsa, okay, one who wrings out the blood. Vahamaktir ba'olat ha'of, okay, and one who offers up a complete offering, olah, burnt offering of a bird. V'haminasech shlosha lugin mayim, and one who utilizes a measure of 3 lugim as part of the water libation. Ushlosha lugin yayin, or who uses measurement of 3 lugin for the wine libation. So those are the situations. He said that Rav felt a non-Kohen would be subject to the death penalty. Tanya kavate de Levi. And we have a Braita that teaches according to Levi. Avodot shezar chayav alehen mita. These are the worship acts, again, that a non-Kohen would be obligated, guilty of the death penalty. Hamerim et hadeshen, one who removes the ash. V'sheva hazaot shebifnim v'sheba metzora, and the 7 sprinklings that apply inside on the parochet, and the 7 that apply to the leper, metzora. V'hama'aleh al gabe hamizbeach, bein davar kasher, bein davar pasul, and one who puts onto the altar something, whether it's fitting or suitable, or something that's invalid. Okay, and so that ends that discussion. Okay, so we see that according to Levi, he does refer to the basically Trumat Hadeshin, and as a result, would consider a Zar not permitted to do so. Okay. Having said all this, we now get to a brand new subject, but it's not so new because we were aware of the fact earlier that there were these lotteries. And so the Gemara comes back now and raises a question. Lama mefaisin? Why these lotteries? Okay. And so the response is problematic. Lama mefaisin? Why do we need these lotteries? What kind of a question is that? Okay. Kida Amran, as we said earlier. So the Gemara wants to rephrase. Ela lama mefaisin v'chozrin umefaisin. Namely, why do we then have a lottery and then go back and have other lotteries? Okay. Remember we said that there were ultimately 3 or 4 lotteries. Why couldn't it have just been done in one situation? That's what the Gemara is trying to get at least according to some Mefarshim. Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Says Rabbi Yochanan, Kedei lahargish kol ha'azara, to stir up everybody, okay? To get them excited about the avoda. That's what Rabbi Yochanan is suggesting. Shneamar, as it says in a pasuk, Asher yachdav namtik sod b'beit Elohim nehelech b'regesh. Okay, that we took counsel together, sweet counsel, in the house of Hashem, and we walked with regesh, with enthusiasm, tumult, activity. So the Gemara asks, B'mem mefisin? Then how then did they carry out these lotteries? Okay, Rav Nachman Amar b'bigdei chol. According to Rav Nachman, the Kohanim were still wearing their, if you will, non-sacred garments. They're not wearing their official Kohen uniform. I'll put it that way. The Rav Sheshet Amar b'bigdei kodesh. And Rav Sheshet said, no, they were wearing their official Kohen uniforms. Okay? At least the 4 garments that the Kohen needed. Okay? Rav Nachman Amar b'bigdei chol. Rav Nachman said non-holy garments. Di'i Amar b'bigdei kodesh. Because if you say we're talking about sacred garments, Ika ba'alei zro'ot, dechamse va'avdei. There are among those Kohanim some very strong-armed individuals who would act with force, with violence, and carry out the worship. In other words, that was the Kohen mafia, so to speak. Okay? They would beat up other Kohanim to be able to get certain jobs. For Rav Sheshet Amar, says Rav Sheshet, b'vigdei kodesh, that they were wearing their sacred garments. Di'i amart b'bigdei chol, because if you said that they were wearing non-sacred garments, agav chavivutei, because of their love for fulfilling the mitzvah of doing the avoda, mikru va'avdei, they might come close and carry out the worship once they got chosen for a particular task, without even thinking, oh, I've got to run back and change my clothes to go do my Kohen thing. Okay? So what happens? Amar Rav Nachman, Mina Aminala, on what basis do I say this? T'tnan, because it's taught elsewhere in a Mishnah, Masrun lechazanim, Vahayu mafshitin otan et bigdehen, v'lo hayu menichin alehem ela michnasayim bilvad. Where the other Mishnah says that they delivered these garments, these items, to the chazanim, let's call them the sextons, the shamases, right? Who would undress, who remove the garments from them and only allow them to remain standing in their pants. Let's go over just a little bit. Okay. My love ba'otan shezachu lefayes. Okay. Doesn't this then refer to those who that merited to participate in the lottery? Right? Amar Rav Huna, says Rav Huna. Yeah. Was there a question there? Okay, no? Okay. So as I said, just a tiny bit. Amar Rav Huna bar Yehuda Amar Rav Sheshet. No. Rav Sheshet still says no. Ba'otan shelo zachu lefayes. No, it refers to those, in other words, those, if they were wearing their holy garments, okay, if they weren't chosen for worship that day, that's when they had to change their clothes. Hachanami mistabra. And this does seem logical, says the Gemara. De'istal gedatach ba'otan shezachu lefayes. That if it was those who merited being able to participate in the lottery, lo hayu menichin alehen ela michnasayim bilvad, they wouldn't have left only pants on them. Okay? Vahatanya, and aren't we taught elsewhere in a Braita? Minayin shelo yehei davar kodem lemichnasayim. How do we know that there was not supposed to put anything else on before the pants? Talmud Lomar, text tells us, Umichnasei bad yihiyu al bisaro, that the breeches, the pants, should be on their flesh. Okay, and that's the case. So we're going to stop right there, okay, for today, right? Because then the Gemara goes back, okay, to present Rav Sheshet's view, the Idach ha lo kasha. And for me, he says it's not a problem because he's going to explain why he holds what he does. Okay? So, as I said, can pick up tomorrow. And I will try to see, as again, I think at 3:30 Israel time. I'm not sure where I still may be 3:30, 8, whatever at the time, wherever I'll be. So I can't assume tomorrow's shiur, and we'll have to see what Erev Shabbos will bring on Friday. Okay, everybody? So I wish you stay well and have a good Shabbos.
Thank you very much. Eskom l'shalom.
Okay,
you,
and
Rev.
we'll see
Bye.
what we can do about